"Oh, Liam, please, right there. Don't ever stop." The words were a whisper, a thread of sound woven into the heavy silence of the night, not a command of passion, but something closer to a plea. It was a sound he knew well, the sound of her trying to hold on to the present moment so tightly that it might leave bruises on the fabric of time. In the pale moonlight that filtered through the bedroom window, her body was a landscape of soft shadows and pale light, her dark hair a spill of ink against the white pillows. He moved against her, a slow, deliberate rhythm meant to reassure, to promise a safety he desperately wanted to believe he could provide. This was their sanctuary, this room filled with the scent of old books and the faint, salty tang of the Maine coastline drifting in on the autumn air. For Liam, this was everything. A life he had stumbled into, a family he had built not from blood, but from the fragments of two broken souls who found shelter in each other. He could hear the gentle, steady breathing of a child from the room next door, the soft rhythm of Maya's sleep, a quiet metronome marking the peaceful passage of their life together. This woman, Elena, and her daughter, they were his world now. To anyone looking in, they were the perfect image of happiness, a quiet academic and his beautiful artist partner raising a bright, lovely little girl in a sleepy coastal town. A perfect life rebuilt from ashes. But as he held her, feeling the last tremors of her release fade into the quiet of the room, an old, familiar anxiety coiled in the pit of his stomach. He knew, in a way he could never bring himself to say aloud, that their peace was a fragile thing, a beautiful glass house built on the edge of a fault line. And he was always listening for the first tremor, the first sign that the ground beneath them was about to give way. It all began with a storm, 6 years before that night of whispered pleas. Not a storm in her heart, not yet, but a real one, a violent nor'easter that threw the Atlantic against the rocky coast of Maine with a fury that felt biblical. The wind howled like a grieving animal, and the rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. Liam had taken refuge in the town's only late-night coffee shop, a small, warm haven of dark wood and the rich scent of roasted beans. He was nursing a lukewarm mug, watching the rain lash against the old paned glass, feeling the familiar ache of a solitude that had become his constant companion since his divorce. His house was quiet, his life was ordered, and his heart was a room with shuttered windows. He was a man who appreciated stillness, yet the loneliness of it was beginning to wear him down. Then the door flew open, torn from someone's grasp by the wind, and she was thrown inside more than she walked. The entire cafe seemed to gasp with the intake of cold, wet air. She stood there for a moment, dripping and trembling on the worn welcome mat, an apparition conjured by the storm. Her dark hair was plastered to her scalp and face, and her simple summer dress, hopelessly inadequate for the weather, was soaked through, clinging to every line of her body. And it was the most prominent line that held Liam's gaze, the impossible, perfect curve of a woman well into the third trimester of her pregnancy. She pushed the wet hair from her face with a shaking hand, and he saw her eyes. They were a startling, piercing blue, and in their depths, he saw a tempest that dwarfed the one raging outside. It was a maelstrom of fear, exhaustion, and a sliver of wild, defiant strength that seemed to be the only thing holding her together. She was beautiful, but it was a tragic, desperate kind of beauty, the kind that hurts to look at. The other patrons, a few students and an old fisherman, glanced over and then quickly looked away, retreating into the safety of their own small worlds. But Liam couldn't look away. He, a professor of literature, a man who spent his days dissecting the tragedies and triumphs of fictional characters, found himself looking at a story that was terrifyingly real. He watched as she scanned the small room, her gaze empty, as if she didn't know what she was looking for, or had forgotten why she had come in. She swayed slightly, and a primal protective instinct he didn't know he possessed rose up in him. He left his half-empty mug on the table and walked towards her. He kept his voice low, gentle. "Are you all right? Can I get you something warm to drink?" She flinched at the sound of his voice, her eyes focusing on him for the first time. He saw a flicker of panic, the look of a cornered animal, and he took a half step back to give her space. "It's all right," he said softly. "You just look like you've had a rough night." For a long moment, she just stared at him, the rain dripping from the hem of her dress to form a small puddle on the floor. Then, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He led her to a small table in a quiet corner and returned a few minutes later with a steaming mug of decaffeinated tea with honey. She wrapped her cold, trembling hands around it, as if it were a source of life itself. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the clinking of her mug against the saucer and the relentless drumming of the storm outside. He didn't ask her name or where she had come from. He didn't ask about the father of the child she carried so prominently. The questions felt like a violation of the fragile truce she seemed to have made with the world by simply stepping into this room. Instead, he talked about the storm, about how these nor'easters could last for days, about the history of the old building they were in. He spoke in a calm, steady monologue, giving her a rope of meaningless words to hold on to in the flood of her own reality. Eventually, she spoke. Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "I had to leave," she said, not looking at him, but staring into her mug as if the answers were floating in the amber liquid. I couldn't stay there anymore. It wasn't safe. There was a universe of pain in that simple statement. Liam didn't press for details. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her truth. He saw the faint bruising on her wrist when her sleeve slid back, a shadow of purple and blue against her pale skin, and his heart clenched. The story was there, a dark and ugly one, and he felt an overwhelming urge to shield her from it, to stand between her and whatever monster she was running from. He was utterly captivated. It wasn't just desire, not in the simple physical sense. It was something deeper, more complex. He was drawn to the fierce, protective way her hand rested on her swollen belly, a constant, unconscious gesture of love. He was drawn to the resilience in her gaze, the fact that even now, soaked and scared and alone, she hadn't completely broken. He saw in her a profound loneliness that mirrored his own, and the sight of it in another person made his own burden feel, for the first time in a long time, a little lighter. The night wore on. The cafe owner began pointedly wiping down the counter, preparing to close. The storm showed no signs of abating. The reality of her situation settled heavily in the space between them. She had no coat, no bag, no money that he could see. She had nowhere to go. He saw the panic begin to rise in her eyes again, the fragile composure she had gathered beginning to crumble. The rational part of his brain, the part that had guided his quiet, sensible life, screamed at him to walk away. This was not his problem. This was trouble, the kind of trouble that could swallow a man whole. But then he looked at her, at the curve of her belly holding an innocent life, at the exhaustion etched on her beautiful face, and the rational part of his brain fell silent. He thought of his empty house, of the spare bedroom with its clean sheets and quiet darkness, a room that had been waiting for a purpose. He heard himself speaking before he had even fully formed the thought. "My house is just a few blocks from here," he said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "It's warm and it's dry. You can stay in the guest room." Elena looked up at him, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. "Just until the storm passes," he added quickly, as much for his own benefit as for hers, just a safe place to rest for the night. She searched his face, looking for a hidden motive, for the catch. But she found only a quiet sincerity, and in that moment, under the hum of the fluorescent lights and the roar of the heavens, she nodded. It was a decision that would redirect the course of both their lives, a simple act of charity that would become the foundation for a love, a family, and a heartbreak more devastating than any storm. The short drive to his house was a cocoon of quiet intimacy, the world outside a raging, watery chaos. The rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers was the only sound, a frantic heartbeat counting down the seconds in the charged silence. When he pulled into the driveway of his modest saltbox house, he turned off the engine and the roar of the storm seemed to rush in to fill the void. He helped her out of the car, his hand hovering near the small of her back, a gesture of support that was careful not to be a touch, not yet. Inside, the house was a sanctuary of warmth and order. The air smelled of wood smoke from a long dead fire, old paper from the books that lined every wall, and the faint, clean scent of lemon oil. For a woman who had just run from a life of chaos, the stillness of Liam's home was like a physical embrace. He showed her to the guest room, a simple space with a sturdy maple bed, a faded armchair, and a single window that overlooked the turbulent ocean. It was a room that had held no life for years, but her presence in it, small and shivering, instantly filled it with a profound significance. He gave her a stack of thick, dry towels and one of his own gray t-shirts to sleep in, the worn cotton soft and smelling faintly of him. The act felt strangely intimate, an offering of his own comfort, his own scent. As he closed the door, leaving her to her privacy, he leaned against the cool wood for a moment, listening. He could hear the soft sounds of her moving about, the rustle of cloth, the creak of the floorboards. A woman, a pregnant, vulnerable woman, was in his house, a stranger, and the knowledge of it sent a tremor through the quiet, predictable architecture of his life. The storm passed in 2 days, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a pale sun. But Elena stayed. The roads were no longer flooded, the immediate danger had passed, but her own personal storm had not. She had nowhere else to go. A fact she admitted in a quiet, shame-faced whisper over breakfast. And Liam, to his own surprise, felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost frightened him. He couldn't bring himself to even suggest she leave. The thought of his house returning to its former silence, of her absence, was suddenly unbearable. So, a few days bled into a week, and then 2, the unspoken agreement solidifying into a new, fragile reality. A routine began to form. He would leave for the university in the mornings, and the house he returned to in the late afternoons was no longer empty. There was a warmth to it, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that was entirely her. His desire for her grew not like a fire, but like a vine, slowly, quietly, wrapping itself around his thoughts until he was completely entangled. It was an obsession of the senses. He would be in his office, trying to focus on Chaucer or Melville, and he would be ambushed by the memory of her scent, a soft, floral fragrance that now clung to the guest room linens and seemed to linger in the hallways. He started to learn the sounds of her presence, the soft pad of her bare feet on the hardwood floors, the gentle hum of her voice as she sometimes spoke quietly to her unborn child, the whisper of pages turning as she made her way through his library. His awareness of her physical form became a constant low-grade fever in his blood. He would catch glimpses of her through doorways, a fleeting image of her standing by the window, her silhouette, a beautiful, maternal shape against the gray light of the sea. He'd watch, unseen, as she moved through his kitchen, her actions graceful and efficient despite her size, her hand always resting on the curve of her belly. He told himself it was compassion, a natural protective instinct for a woman in her condition. It was a necessary and noble lie. The boundaries between them, once so clear, began to blur and fade. The careful distance he tried to maintain was eroded by the simple, unavoidable intimacy of sharing a home. One evening, she was helping him put away dishes, and they both reached for the same cabinet handle. Their hands brushed, a fleeting contact of skin on skin that sent a jolt of electricity through him. They both pulled back as if burned, a flush rising on her cheeks and a sudden tightness in his chest. They mumbled apologies, their eyes refusing to meet, but the space between them was suddenly charged with everything they were not saying. He saw her as a woman then, not just a pregnant woman, not just a victim, but as Elena, a woman whose touch he was beginning to crave with a desperate, aching intensity. He started leaving books on the coffee table he thought she might like, and would feel a quiet thrill when he found her engrossed in them later. She, in turn, began to leave her own small marks on his sterile environment. A small vase of wildflowers on the mantelpiece, a throw blanket neatly folded over the arm of the sofa. She was nesting, not just for her child, but within the walls of his life, and he was letting her, inviting her, to do it. One night, he came downstairs long after he should have been asleep, his mind too restless for slumber. He found her in the kitchen, sitting at the small table, bathed in the ghostly white light of the open refrigerator. She was just a silhouette, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He didn't turn on the light. He simply pulled out the chair opposite her and sat, the table a small, wooden raft in an ocean of darkness. "I'm scared," she finally whispered, the words seeming to be torn from her. "I don't know how to do this alone." He listened as she spoke of her fears, her voice thick with unshed tears, her anxieties about the coming birth, about her ability to be a good mother. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply listened, and when she was done, he spoke with a quiet certainty that surprised even himself. "You're not alone," he said. And in that moment, the last of the boundaries dissolved. He was no longer just a host, a benefactor providing temporary shelter. He had crossed a line, stepping into the role of confidant, of protector, of a partner in her fear. The physical desire that had been simmering just beneath the surface now had a name, a purpose. It was intertwined with a profound, terrifying, and exhilarating need to care for her, to keep her safe. He didn't know if it was love, but it felt dangerously close, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he would never, ever ask her to leave. The weeks leading up to Maya's birth were a period of suspended reality, a quiet, humming stillness before the inevitable change. Elena's body grew heavier, her movements slower, more deliberate. The house seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, and the simmering tension between them had transformed into a kind of gentle, protective partnership. The unspoken desire was still there, a low flame beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by the looming, beautiful reality of the life she carried. Liam found himself orbiting her, his every thought and action dictated by her needs. He cooked meals rich in iron. He stacked pillows behind her back. He read to her in the evenings when she was too tired to focus on the words herself. He was no longer just a man attracted to a woman. He was a caretaker, a guardian of both mother and child. The moment came, as such moments often do, in the dead of night, shattering the peace. It wasn't a dramatic rush of water, but a small, sharp cry of pain from down the hall that jolted Liam from a deep sleep. He was by her side in an instant, finding her sitting up in bed, her face pale in the moonlight, her hands clutching her belly. "Liam," she breathed, and her voice was tight with a pain that was new, that was real. I think it's time." Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him, but he forced it down, replacing it with a strange, preternatural calm. This was it. There was no one else to call, no other name she could cry out. There was only him. The journey to the hospital was a blur of rain-slicked streets and the hypnotic sweep of the wipers. Elena was quiet now, her eyes closed, her body rigid with each escalating contraction. Liam drove with a focus he had never known, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on her knee, a point of contact in the storm of her pain. He murmured meaningless words of comfort, his voice a low, steady anchor in the darkness. In the harsh, fluorescent light of the emergency room entrance, she looked small and terrified. He filled out the endless forms, his own hand shaking slightly as he wrote her name. When the nurse, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, asked for the father's information, Elena was lost in another wave of pain. Liam's throat went dry. "Just leave it blank," he said quietly. The nurse looked at him, then at Elena, and a flicker of understanding passed over her face. "And you are?" she asked, her pen hovering over the page. Liam hesitated, the word friend feeling like a lie, a hollow, pathetic description for what he had become. "I'm with her," he said finally, the words simple, yet carrying all the weight of a sacred oath. They had offered him the waiting room, a sterile space with uncomfortable chairs and old magazines. But when he looked at Elena, her eyes wide with fear as they wheeled her away, he knew he couldn't leave her. He followed them into the delivery room, a place of beeping machines and cold metallic surfaces, and put on the paper gown they handed him without a second thought. For the next several hours, the world shrank to the confines of that room. All of his academic knowledge, all the complexities of his quiet life, they all burned away, leaving only the raw, primal reality of the moment. He became an extension of her, his purpose singular and absolute, to help her through this. He held her hand, his fingers laced through hers as she squeezed with a strength that astonished him. He wiped the sweat from her brow with a cool cloth. He held a cup of ice chips to her parched lips. He breathed with her, his own lungs aching in sympathy, his voice a constant, low murmur in her ear, telling her she was strong, that she could do this, that he was right there. In the crucible of her labor, he saw the very essence of her. He saw a warrior. The fear was there, yes, but beneath it was a bedrock of courage that left him in awe. In her moments of greatest agony, she would lock her gaze on her fierce blue eyes demanding his strength, and he gave it to her without reservation. He poured every ounce of his own will into her, wishing he could absorb her pain into his own body. He was no longer a spectator, a friend, a host. In that room, under the harsh, unforgiving lights, they were a unit, a team, bound together in the sacred, terrifying work of bringing a new life into the world. And then, with a final, guttural cry that seemed to tear from the very center of the earth, it was over. A sudden, shocking silence descended, and in that silence, a new sound emerged. A tiny, furious, beautiful wail. Maya's first cry. The sound hit Liam with the force of a physical blow, and a sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped his own throat. He watched, his vision blurred with tears, as the nurse laid the small, perfect creature on Elena's chest. He saw Elena look down at her daughter, and the expression on her face was one of such profound, transcendent love that it rearranged his entire understanding of the word. He felt like an intruder, a witness to a miracle that was not his own, yet he was inextricably part of it. Later, in the quiet dimness of the recovery room, Elena slept, a deep, exhausted sleep. A nurse came in, holding a small bundle wrapped in a pink blanket. "Would you like to hold her?" she whispered. Liam was terrified. He was a man of books and theories, not of fragile living things. But he nodded, his hands clumsy as he took the small weight into his arms. He looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face of Maya. Her eyes were closed, her little mouth working in a silent suckle. She was so impossibly small, so utterly dependent. And as he stood there, rocking her gently, a silent vow formed in his heart, a promise made not with words but with the entire force of his being. He promised this sleeping infant that she would never be alone. He promised her she would be safe. He promised her that he would be the father she deserved, regardless of biology, regardless of the man who had abandoned her. In that moment, holding another man's child, Liam found his own purpose. When they brought Maya home 3 days later, the house was no longer his. He carried her across the threshold in her car seat, and the act felt as solemn and binding as any wedding vow. The quiet, academic sanctuary he had once inhabited was gone forever. It was now a home, filled with the unpredictable, chaotic, and beautiful sounds of a newborn. The dynamic between him and Elena had been irrevocably forged into something new. The desire was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but it was now part of a much larger, more powerful emotion. It was a love born not of passion or romance in the traditional sense, but forged in the shared fire of creation, a partnership cemented by the shared responsibility for a new life. As he watched Elena rock Maya to sleep in the old armchair, the same chair he had sat in alone for so many nights, he knew this was it. This was family, and he would do anything at all to protect it. The first few months of Maya's life were a blur of sleepless nights and chaotic days, a trial by fire that forged an unbreakable bond between Liam and Elena. They operated as a seamless unit, a silent, intuitive team navigating the endless cycle of feeding, changing, and soothing. They moved around each other in the small house with a familiar, practiced grace, their lives interwoven by the needs of the tiny creature who was the sun in their new universe. The raw, desperate desire Liam had felt in the beginning had been transmuted, refined by shared exhaustion and mutual respect into something deeper, a quiet and profound affection that felt more stable, more real than passion ever could. But the passion was not gone. It was merely dormant, a sleeping giant beneath the surface of their domesticity, waiting for a moment of stillness to awaken. That moment came on a cool October night, nearly 4 months after Maya was born. The baby had been fussy all evening, a marathon of crying that had left them both frayed and exhausted. But now, finally, she was asleep, a deep and steady slumber that filled the house with a profound, welcome silence. Liam found Elena in the living room, curled on the sofa, bathed in the soft, golden light of a single lamp. She was staring into the middle distance, a look of bone-deep weariness on her face that made his heart ache. He poured 2 small glasses of wine, a bottle he'd been saving for a celebration that had never come, and sat beside her. "We survived another day," he said, his voice a low murmur, and she gave him a small, tired smile. They drank in a comfortable silence, the quiet intimacy of 2 soldiers resting after a long battle. "Thank you, Liam," she said suddenly, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely showed. She turned to face him, her startling blue eyes glistening. "For all of this, for everything, I never would have made it without you." He saw her vulnerability then, stripped bare of all her usual defenses. He saw the woman who had stumbled into his life during a storm, and the warrior who had given birth in a sterile hospital room, and the loving mother who gave every piece of herself to her child. He set his glass down and reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of dark hair from her cheek. His touch was tentative, a question. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his hand, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment, a silent surrender. The air between them shifted, the comfortable quiet suddenly charged with a voltage that had been building for months. All the unspoken words, all the stolen glances, all the pent-up longing coalesced in that single lingering touch. He moved his hand to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her cheek. He could feel his own heart hammering against his ribs. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away, but she met him halfway. The first kiss was not explosive. It was soft, searching, a taste of wine and exhaustion and a deep, soul-shaking relief. It was a kiss of gratitude, of recognition, of two lonely people finally finding a harbor in one another. It deepened slowly, her lips parting under his, and the sleeping giant of passion began to stir. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, and he could feel the soft, womanly curves of her body, a body that had created life, a body he had come to worship from afar. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. She looked at him, her eyes dark, with an emotion he couldn't quite read. "Liam," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "We can't. This isn't right." It was a token protest, the last gasp of a rational mind that knew their situation was complicated, that he was her savior, not her lover. "It's the only thing that's felt right in months," he answered, his voice husky. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet, and led her by the hand, not to the guest room that had been hers for so long, but to his own bedroom at the end of the hall. This was a crossing of the final threshold. Her presence in his bed would erase the last vestige of her status as a guest, making her a permanent part of his life. In the dim light of his room, he slowly undressed her. His hands trembled as he untied the simple ribbon of her silk nightgown. It slid from her shoulders, pooling at her feet like liquid moonlight. Beneath it, she wore a simple set of white lace lingerie, practical and unadorned, which was somehow more intimate, more breathtakingly real than any seductive garment could ever be. He saw the faint stretch marks on her belly, silver lines that mapped the miracle of her body. He saw the fullness of her breasts, the softness of her hips. She was not the flawless girl from a magazine. She was a woman, a mother, and to him, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He kissed her then, a long, slow kiss that was a vow of acceptance, of worship. He laid her on the bed, his own clothes quickly discarded, and explored her body with a reverence that bordered on prayer. This was not a taking, it was a discovery. Every touch was an affirmation, every kiss a celebration of her. He felt her initial tension, the slight hesitation in her response, and he slowed down, his hands and mouth gentle, reassuring. He was relearning her and teaching her that she was safe, that she was wanted, that she was desired for exactly who she was. The quiet, hesitant sounds she made began to change, her shy sighs deepening into soft moans of pleasure. She arched into his touch, her hands gripping his shoulders, her body finally letting go of its last defenses. When he finally entered her, it felt less like a joining and more like a homecoming. It was slow and deep and overwhelmingly emotional. They moved together in a rhythm that felt ancient and new all at once, their bodies finally saying everything their words could not. In the peak of it all, she cried out his name, not in protest, but in a desperate, shattering release. "Liam. Oh God, Liam." And in that sound, he heard it all. The gratitude, the pent-up loneliness, the relief, and the terrifying, beautiful joy of finally letting go. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, their bodies damp, their breathing slowly returning to normal. The silence that filled the room was no longer one of restraint, but of profound, peaceful contentment. The final barrier had not just been crossed, it had been completely obliterated. She rested her head on his chest, her hair soft against his skin, and he held her as if he would never let her go. This was no longer his bed, his room, his house. It was theirs. A life had been born within these walls months ago, and now, in the quiet darkness, a family had been consummated. The 5 years that followed were the happiest of Liam's life. They passed in a sun-drenched, idyllic haze, a long and beautiful chapter he would later look back on as a kind of perfect, impossible dream. The house by the sea, once a monument to his solitude, was filled with the sounds of a family. The constant patter of small feet on the hardwood floors, the soaring flights of Maya's laughter, the low, comforting murmur of his conversations with Elena late at night. They settled into a rhythm that was as natural and steady as the tides. He was no longer just a host or a lover. He was a father, a partner, a man who had been given a second chance at a life he'd thought was lost to him forever. They built a world for Maya, a fortress of love and stability against the ghosts of the past. Summers were spent on the beach, Liam teaching a squealing Maya how to brave the cold Atlantic waves, while Elena watched from a blanket, sketching them in her notepad, her art finally shedding its shadows and bursting with color and light. Autumns were for walks in the woods, the three of them bundled in sweaters, collecting vibrantly colored leaves, and returning home to the scent of baking apples. Winters were for hibernation, for building forts out of blankets in the living room and reading stacks of picture books by the crackling fire, their bodies a warm, tangled heap against the cold. To the small, close-knit town, they were a fixture, a slightly unconventional but deeply loving family. He was Professor Evans, and they were the beautiful artist and her bright, charming daughter who accompanied him to the farmer's market on Saturdays. He was Daddy Liam, a name that had come from Maya's lips so naturally one day that it brought tears to his eyes, a name that felt more real and true than his own. He loved Maya with a fierce, unconditional devotion that erased the lines of biology. He was the one who kissed her scraped knees, who patiently taught her how to read, who sat through preschool recitals with a lump of pride in his throat. He saw Elena's beauty in her daughter's inquisitive blue eyes, but he also saw a spirit that was all her own, and he nurtured it, protected it, cherished it. And in watching him with her daughter, Elena seemed to heal. The haunted, hunted look he'd first seen in her eyes was replaced by a soft, contented glow. She blossomed in the safety of his love. Her art career began to flourish, her paintings of the Maine coastline and vibrant portraits of Maya gaining recognition in local galleries. She was a passionate, attentive lover, a witty and engaging partner, a wonderful mother. She seemed, for all intents and purposes, to be a woman who had finally found her peace. But their happiness, as perfect as it appeared, was a meticulously crafted structure built around a hollow space. At its center was a name that was never spoken, Julian. He was a ghost who was banished but never exorcised. Liam knew, on some level, that a part of Elena's past was locked away, a door he was not permitted to open. He chose not to knock. His love for her was so complete, his fear of losing this life so profound, that he engaged in a kind of willful blindness. He accepted the parts of her she was willing to give, and consciously ignored the parts she kept hidden. Sometimes, the facade would crack, just for a moment. He would come upon her unexpectedly, finding her staring out the window at the gray, churning sea, her expression so full of a distant, aching sorrow that it made him feel like a stranger. When she noticed him, the mask would slip back into place, her face breaking into a bright, warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and she would quickly change the subject. Once, while looking for an old photo album in a storage closet, he found it. A small, dark wooden box, intricately carved and held shut by a small, tarnished lock. He knew, with an instinct that made his stomach clench, that this was it. This was the vault. He placed it back on the shelf, behind a stack of old blankets, and never mentioned it. Asking about the box felt like tempting fate, like acknowledging that the ground beneath their perfect life might not be as solid as he pretended. He told himself it didn't matter. The past was the past. What mattered was the present, the smell of pancakes on a Sunday morning, the weight of Maya asleep in his lap, the feel of Elena's body next to his in the dark. What they had was real, built day by day through shared moments of joy and struggle. He believed his love was a force strong enough to be a permanent sanctuary, that the life they had built was a fortress no ghost could ever breach. The illusion was at its most powerful on Maya's 5th birthday. The backyard was filled with colorful balloons and the shrieks of small children. Liam stood by the grill, flipping burgers, a contented smile on his face, as he watched Maya, her face alight with pure joy as she tore the wrapping paper from a new bicycle. This, he thought, This is what real happiness feels like. He looked over at Elena, wanting to share the moment, to exchange that look of shared parental pride that had become their secret language. He found her standing near the old oak tree at the edge of the yard, watching Maya with an intensity that was unnerving. For a split second, before she noticed him looking, her public smile was gone. In its place was an expression of such profound and bottomless grief, it stole the air from his lungs. It was the look of someone mourning a loss that hadn't happened yet, or perhaps one that was still happening. It was the look of a woman who knew she was living on borrowed time. Then, her eyes met his, and the transformation was instantaneous. The sorrow vanished, replaced by a dazzling smile, and she raised her wine glass to him in a toast. The moment was gone, but the image was seared into his memory. He smiled back, pushing the cold spike of fear down deep, where he kept all the other unaskable questions. He turned back to the grill, to the laughter, to the perfect sunlit day, choosing, as he always did, to believe in the beautiful lie. It was the 6th anniversary of the storm. They didn't mark it on a calendar, but they both felt its quiet significance, a silent acknowledgement of the night their two disparate worlds had collided. Maya, now a vibrant 6-year-old, was at her first ever sleepover, and the house was cloaked in a stillness they hadn't known in years. The silence was vast, a blank canvas, and Liam had decided to fill it with a memory. He cooked for her, a meticulous, loving preparation of her favorite meal, and opened a bottle of expensive wine he'd been saving. As they sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, illuminated by the soft, flickering light of candles, they were not just mom and dad. They were Liam and Elena again, two people rediscovering each other in the quiet space their daughter's absence had left behind. Their lovemaking, in the years since that first tentative night, had become the physical language of their life together. It was a landscape they knew intimately, a place of comfort, of play, of profound connection. But tonight was different. There was a charge in the air, a sense of occasion. This night was a celebration, a reaffirmation of the choice they made every day to be a family. After dinner, as Liam cleared the plates, Elena placed a hand on his arm, her eyes dark and full of a promise that made his pulse quicken. "Don't be long," she whispered, her lips brushing his ear, before disappearing down the hallway toward the bedroom. He followed a few minutes later, his heart thudding with a familiar, welcome anticipation. He found her standing by the window, looking out at the moonlight on the water, wearing only a thin, black silk robe. When she heard him enter, she turned, and with a slow, deliberate smile, she let the robe slide from her shoulders to the floor. The breath caught in Liam's throat. He had seen her body 1,000 times, had mapped every inch of it with his hands and his mouth, but the sight of her now felt like a revelation. She was wearing the black lace lingerie he had bought her for her birthday, a stark, breathtaking contrast to her pale skin. 6 years of his love and care, of peace and stability, had transformed her. The fragile, postpartum softness of their first time together had been sculpted into the confident, lush curves of a woman in her prime. Her breasts were full and high above the delicate lace, her waist still slender, flowing into the generous, alluring curve of her hips. This was not the frightened girl who had stumbled out of the rain. This was a goddess, powerful and self-possessed, and she was entirely his. "You're beautiful," he breathed, the words feeling utterly inadequate. She closed the distance between them, her hands coming up to cup his face. "Tonight I am yours," she said, her voice a low, throaty purr. The kiss was not gentle or searching. It was deep and hungry, and full of the certainty of 6 years of shared nights. He swept her into his arms and carried her to the bed, their bed, the sheets cool against their heated skin. This was not the slow, emotional discovery of their first encounter. This was a passionate, knowing dance. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. He knew the exact spot behind her ear that made her shiver. She knew the precise pressure of his hands on her back that made him groan. It was a raw, joyful celebration of their physical bond. He worshipped her body, his hands and lips relearning the familiar, beloved territories. He took his time, delighting in her reactions, in the way she arched her back, her fingers tangling in his hair. She was an active, eager participant, her own touch bold and demanding, meeting his passion with an equal, uninhibited fire. She was no longer just receiving his love. She was claiming him, marking him as her own. He moved over her, their bodies slotting together with a perfect, practiced familiarity. Her legs wrapped around his waist, pulling him deeper, and he felt a surge of fierce, primal possessiveness. This woman, this life, this family, it was all his. He had built it, had earned it. As their rhythm grew more urgent, more desperate, he leaned down, his lips close to her ear, his voice a ragged whisper against the sounds of their lovemaking. "You feel so good, Elena. Tell me you're mine." He needed to hear it to brand this perfect moment with her words. She answered without a second of hesitation, her head thrown back, her eyes squeezed shut in ecstasy. Her voice was a breathless, unrestrained cry of pure pleasure and affirmation. "Yes, Liam, always." Her hips rose to meet his every thrust, driving him wild. "Oh God, Liam, yes. Oh, deeper, please." Her words, her complete and total surrender to him and to the moment, was the only permission he needed. He let go of his control, pouring all of his love, his devotion, his possessive certainty into her until they were both consumed by a shattering, blinding release. Afterward, they lay entwined, their limbs tangled, their bodies slick with sweat, the room filled with the scent of their passion. He held her, his heart slowly returning to a normal rhythm, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. This was the pinnacle. This was the peak of the life he had so carefully constructed. In this moment, with Elena's head resting on his chest, her breathing soft and even in sleep, he felt utterly and completely secure. He was her harbor, her sanctuary. He had calmed her storm. He believed with every fiber of his being that their love was an indestructible fortress, that nothing and no one could ever touch the perfect, beautiful world they had built together. He was wrong. The perfect peace, the one Liam had come to believe was permanent and unassailable, was shattered on a perfectly ordinary Saturday afternoon. The sun was warm, the sky a vast, cloudless blue. Liam was on the porch, reading, the scent of freshly cut grass hanging in the air. In the yard, Maya, a whirlwind of boundless 6-year-old energy, was trying to teach their very unimpressed cat how to play fetch. From the open window of the small barn that served as her studio, he could hear the faint, happy sound of Elena humming along to the radio. It was a moment of such profound and simple domestic bliss that Liam felt a familiar swell of gratitude in his chest. This was his life. It was real. The sound came first, a low, guttural purr that was utterly alien to their quiet seaside street. It was the sound of money and power. A moment later, a long, impossibly black sedan, a Mercedes that looked like it had been carved from a block of polished obsidian, glided to a stop at the end of their gravel driveway. Liam put his book down, a flicker of annoyance passing through him. He assumed it was a lost tourist looking for directions to the more ostentatious summer homes a few miles up the coast. He stood up, preparing to be helpful, his protector instincts already on a low simmer as Maya stopped her game to stare at the shiny car. But then he saw Elena. She had emerged from her studio, a palette in one hand, a brush in the other. She was frozen at the doorway, and the look on her face was one Liam had not seen in 6 years. It was the face of the woman who had stumbled into the coffee shop during the storm. All the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a waxy, translucent white. Her eyes were wide, her pupils blown black with a terror so pure and primal, it seemed to suck the very sunlight from the air around her. Her hand, the one not holding the brush, flew to her throat in a gesture of pure, instinctual fear. Liam's blood ran cold. This was no lost tourist. This was the ghost. The car door opened, and a man unfolded himself from the driver's seat. He was tall, dressed in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Liam's car. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with dark hair, a strong jaw, and a smile that was perfectly crafted but held no warmth at all. He moved with an easy, arrogant grace, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the gravel as he walked towards them, his eyes fixed on Elena. He ignored Liam completely. "Elena," the man said, his voice smooth and deep, carrying an unnerving familiarity. "You look well. Motherhood suits you." Liam moved then, his body acting before his mind could catch up. He stepped off the porch and placed himself squarely between the man and his family, a human shield. Maya, sensing the sudden, terrible shift in the atmosphere, ran to hide behind Liam's legs, her small hands clutching the back of his jeans. "Can I help you?" Liam's voice was steady, but he could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The man's smile widened slightly, but his eyes, cold and dark, finally shifted to Liam, looking him up and down with a fleeting, dismissive glance. It was the look of a wolf assessing a sheepdog. He turned his attention back to Elena, who was still rooted to the spot, a statue of terror. "I always told you I'd find you," he said softly, yet the words carried across the yard like a gunshot. He then let his gaze drop to the small girl peeking out from behind Liam. "And you," he said, his voice softening into something that was meant to be charming but was utterly menacing. "You must be Maya. You have your mother's eyes." "Who are you?" Liam demanded, his voice sharper this time. "You need to leave. Now." For the first time, the man, Julian, addressed him directly, though he never made full eye contact. "This doesn't concern you," he said, a note of finality in his tone. He looked at Elena, a silent command passing between them, a history Liam could only guess at. He saw her flinch, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through her entire body. The flicker of something else he saw in her eyes then wasn't desire. It was the terrified resignation of a creature that has been recaptured. "It concerns me when a stranger shows up at my home and frightens my family," Liam said, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Julian let out a short, humorless laugh. He took another step forward, and the air crackled with a palpable sense of danger. "Your family?" he repeated, savoring the words with a cruel irony. He finally looked Liam in the eye, and what Liam saw there was a bottomless contempt. "You're the professor, right? The quiet man, her safe little harbor." He shook his head slowly. "You've been keeping something that belongs to me." He then looked past Liam, his voice ringing out with chilling clarity, dropping the bomb that would shatter their world. "I've come to see my daughter." Silence, the hum of insects, the distant cry of a gull, the gentle rustle of leaves in the oak tree, it all vanished. The world stopped. The words echoed in the space between them, an undeniable, catastrophic truth. Liam felt as if the ground had fallen away beneath his feet. He slowly turned to look at Elena, his face a mask of disbelief, his eyes begging her, pleading with her to deny it, to scream that this man was a liar, a lunatic. But she said nothing. She couldn't meet his gaze. She just stared at Julian, her silence a confession, a betrayal more profound than any words could ever be. In that moment, the woman he loved, the woman whose body he knew as well as his own, became a stranger. Julian had won. He knew it. He didn't need to press his advantage. The damage was done. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a slim, silver business card case. He extended a card, not to Liam, but to Elena. "I'm at the Grand Harbor Hotel," he said, his voice returning to its smooth, business-like cadence. "Suite 801. We have a lot to talk about, you and I. Call me tomorrow." He didn't wait for a reply. He gave Maya one last, long look, a look of appraisal, of ownership, then turned and walked back to his car with the same unhurried confidence with which he had arrived. The engine purred to life, and the black sedan retreated down the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust and a chasm of broken trust in its wake. The car was gone, but the ghost remained, standing right between them. Maya tugged on Liam's jeans. "Daddy Liam?" she asked, her small voice trembling. "Who was that man? Why did he make Mommy so sad?" Liam had no answer. He could only look at Elena, at the tears that were now silently streaming down her pale cheeks, and feel the beautiful, 5-year dream dissolving into a nightmare. The fortress had been breached. The peace was gone, and in its place was a cold, terrifying silence, filled with the echoes of a life he had never known and a truth that was about to destroy them all. The silence Julian left behind was heavier and more suffocating than any storm. It filled the house, seeping into the floorboards and clinging to the curtains. That evening, they moved around each other like ghosts, the unspoken truth a third person in the room with them. Maya, sensitive to the seismic shift in her parents' world, was quiet and clingy, her usual vibrant energy extinguished. After Liam finally got her to sleep, he found Elena in the kitchen, staring out the window into the blackness, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were freezing. He approached her gently, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. "Elena," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "you have to talk to me. Who is he?" She turned, and her face was a mask of anguish. The tears she had been holding back all day finally came, silent and desperate. "He was my husband," she choked out, the words tasting like poison, "from another life. A mistake." She told him a story then, a heavily edited version of the truth, painting a picture of a youthful mistake, a man with a dark temper she had to escape from to protect her unborn child. It was a story designed to make Liam the hero, the savior, but she left out the fire, the passion, the magnetic, destructive pull that had bound her to Julian in the first place. She ended her story with a plea. "I have to see him, Liam. I have to meet with him, to set boundaries. For Maya, I have to make him understand that this is our life now, and he can't just destroy it." Every instinct in Liam screamed no. He wanted to lock the doors, to forbid her from ever seeing that man again, to shield her with his own body if he had to. But he saw the desperate resolve in her eyes. He was her safe harbor, but he was not her warden. If he tried to cage her, she would only resent him for it. He was trapped. To trust her was to risk losing her. To forbid her was to risk losing her. So he did the only thing he could. He nodded, a slow, reluctant gesture of consent that felt like a betrayal of himself. "Okay," he said, his voice hollow. "For Maya." The day of the meeting, a thick, unbearable tension settled over the house. They were meticulously polite to one another, the careful language of strangers. After breakfast, she went upstairs to get ready, and Liam sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee he didn't want, listening to the sounds from above. He heard the closet door slide open, the rustle of hangers, a longer pause than usual. He heard the spray of a perfume bottle. When she finally came downstairs, his heart sank. She was not dressed for a difficult confrontation or a business meeting. She was dressed for Julian. She was wearing a deep emerald green dress he hadn't seen in years, a sheath of silk that clung to her figure in a way her comfortable, paint-splattered artist clothes never did. Her hair was styled, her makeup was perfect, a subtle enhancement of her beauty that was both armor and invitation. And then there was the scent. It wasn't her usual light floral perfume. This was something different, something musky and complex, a scent that spoke of late nights and expensive restaurants, a scent from her other life. She was transforming before his eyes, shedding the skin of the quiet, seaside artist and slipping back into the skin of the woman who had once been Julian's wife. "There's a new gallery owner in Portland I'm meeting for lunch," she said, the lie sounding thin and brittle in the quiet kitchen. She didn't look him in the eye. "I won't be late." Liam just nodded, the sickness in his stomach too great for words. He watched from the window as she drove away, a beautiful, devastating stranger in a green dress, heading towards a past he could not protect her from. The narrative followed her, a shadow in the passenger seat. Elena's hands were trembling on the steering wheel. With every mile that brought her closer to the Grand Harbor Hotel, she felt a dizzying mix of terror and a strange, thrilling anticipation she refused to name. The hotel lobby was a world away from her quiet life, a place of polished marble, hushed voices, and the quiet hum of wealth. It was Julian's world. She felt his presence even before she reached the elevator, a familiar, dangerous energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. He opened the door to the suite before she could knock, as if he'd been waiting right behind it. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was dressed in a casual, obscenely expensive-looking cashmere sweater and dark trousers, looking relaxed, powerful, and utterly in control. "Elena," he said, his voice a low purr as his eyes swept over her, an appreciative, possessive gaze that made her feel both naked and seen. "You came." The suite was breathtaking, with a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic view of the harbor, the same view she and Liam could only see from a distance. "I'm only here to talk about Maya," she said, her voice firmer than she felt, refusing his offer of a drink. He laughed, a soft, patronizing sound. "Always so direct," he said, moving to stand beside her at the window. "Of course we'll talk about Maya, but first, just tell me one thing. Are you happy? Here? With him?" He gestured vaguely out the window, a dismissal of her entire world. "Playing house with that gentle, sad-eyed professor? Is this really you, Lena?" The old nickname, the one only he had ever used, was a physical blow. He didn't wait for her answer. He began to talk about their past, not the bad parts, not the fights or the fear, but the fire. He spoke of nights in Paris, of driving too fast down winding coastal roads, of the raw, chaotic, all-consuming passion they had shared. He wasn't just reminiscing. He was seducing her with the memory of who she used to be. "He gave you a quiet life," Julian murmured, his voice close to her ear. "I made you feel alive. Don't tell me you don't miss it. Don't tell me you don't miss us." She tried to fight it. She spoke of Maya, of the stability she needed, of the peace she had found with Liam. Her words sounded weak, hollow, even to her own ears. Julian's presence was overwhelming, a force of nature that warped the reality she had so carefully constructed. He knew her weaknesses, her vanities, the secret, wild part of her that chafed under the gentle, predictable rhythm of her life with Liam. She hated him for it. She hated him for seeing it, for naming it, and a treacherous, shameful part of her thrilled to it. He made her feel seen in a way Liam, with his unconditional, gentle love, never could. He never touched her, but he didn't have to. His proximity, his scent, the intensity of his gaze, it was an assault. He had successfully reignited the toxic, addictive dynamic that had defined their relationship. He was the storm, and she had almost forgotten how much she loved to dance in the rain. She left an hour later, her head spinning, her resolve shattered. The meeting had settled nothing. It had only opened old wounds and exposed the deep, dangerous fault line running through her heart. She drove home in a daze, the carefully constructed piece of the last 6 years in ruins. As she pulled into the driveway, she saw Liam waiting on the porch, his face etched with worry. She took a deep breath, slipped the mask of composure back into place, and prepared her next lie. The first crack had appeared, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The weeks following Elena's meeting with Julian were a slow, agonizing descent into a private hell. The warmth that had once filled their home was leached away, replaced by a cold, pervasive tension. They spoke in carefully constructed, polite sentences, the easy intimacy they had shared now a distant memory. Elena had become a ghost in her own life, her body present, but her mind and heart clearly elsewhere. Her phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter, was now her constant companion, always clutched in her hand or placed screen down, a silent, glowing sentinel guarding her secrets. She took hushed phone calls in her studio with the door closed, and when Liam would walk in, she would end the call abruptly, a guilty flush creeping up her neck. Liam, no longer willfully blind, had become a reluctant detective in his own home. He saw everything. He saw the new, expensive-looking scarf she wore, a gift she claimed she'd bought for herself. He noticed her frequent, vague excuses for leaving the house, a sudden need for a specific art supply from a store an hour away, a lunch with a friend he had never heard of before. Their physical intimacy, once a source of profound connection, became a desolate landscape. She would either rebuff his advances with excuses of tiredness, or she would submit with a distant, chilling passivity, her body there but her spirit 1,000 miles away. He was making love to a beautiful, hollow shell, and the loneliness of it was a physical ache in his chest. He knew she was seeing Julian, knew she was lying to him with every breath she took, but he couldn't bring himself to force the final, catastrophic confrontation. He was clinging to the wreckage of their beautiful life, hoping against hope that the storm would pass. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening. Elena, looking radiant and devastatingly beautiful in a new dress, told him she was attending a donor gala at a gallery in Portland. The lie was so practiced, so smooth, it made him sick. He kissed her goodbye at the door, the taste of her perfumed betrayal on his lips, and watched her drive away. The house fell silent, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall measuring out the seconds of his torment. He paced the floors, a caged animal, his mind a whirlwind of suspicion and heartbreak. He couldn't live like this anymore. He had to know. He remembered the iPad she often used for sketching, which she'd left on the kitchen counter. With trembling hands, he picked it up. Her messages were linked to it. It felt like a violation, a desecration of the trust they once had, but he was a man drowning, and this was the only solid thing to grasp onto. He opened the app, his heart hammered against his ribs. And there it was, a thread of messages under Julian's name. He read them, each word, a new nail in the coffin of his happiness. They were filled with a toxic, intimate shorthand, references to their shared past, plans for their future. And then he saw the last message, sent from Julian just 20 minutes earlier. The champagne is cold and the bed is warm. I'm counting the seconds until I can feel you again. The world tilted on its axis. The air was forced from his lungs. It was not a suspicion anymore. It was a fact, a glowing, undeniable truth on a screen in his hands. The narrative splits, leaving Liam in his silent, shattered kitchen, and follows Elena. She drove not to a gallery, but back to the Grand Harbor Hotel, back to the Lion's Den. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a rhythm of guilt, fear, and a dark, electric excitement. This was wrong. It was a betrayal of the kindest man she had ever known, a man who had saved her, a man she truly did love in her own broken way. But Julian's pull was like a drug, a relapse into a fever she had mistaken for passion. He represented the wild, reckless, selfish part of herself she had tried to bury, and it had clawed its way back to the surface. Julian opened the door to the suite, a wolfish, triumphant smile on his face. He pulled her inside, his mouth crashing down on hers before the door was even closed. The kiss was not like Liam's. It was not tender or loving. It was a brutal, possessive act of reclamation, a kiss that tasted of whiskey and power and a shared, destructive history. She tried to resist, her hands pushing against his chest. "Julian, no," she gasped when he finally gave her a moment to breathe. "We can't do this. I'm with Liam. I love him." Julian laughed, a low, cruel sound. "You love his safety," he purred, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her head back. "You love his predictable little life, but you don't love him. Not like you loved me. Not with fire." He backed her against the vast plate glass window. The city lights of Portland spread out behind her like a galaxy of fallen stars, cold and distant. The smooth, cool glass was a shock against the heated skin of her back. His body was hard and demanding against hers, and her token resistance was melting away with every bruising kiss, every possessive touch. This was not a seduction. It was an invasion, a hostile takeover of her body and her will. He unzipped her dress with a single, violent tug, the sound of the tearing fabric echoing the tearing of her life. He was rough, impatient, his hands staking their claim on the body he still considered his property. It was nothing like the reverent, worshipful way Liam touched her. It was a storm of pure, selfish lust, and she was drowning in it, a willing victim. He lifted her against the window, the city lights a dizzying backdrop to her betrayal. As he drove into her, it was a collision of past and present, a desperate, self-destructive act of surrender. It was painful and shameful, and it was the most alive she had felt in years. Tears of guilt and self-loathing streamed down her face, but they were mingled with the sounds of a pleasure so intense it was agonizing. She wrapped her legs around him, pulling him closer, abandoning herself completely to the ruin. "Oh, Julian," she sobbed, her voice breaking, a ragged confession whispered against the cold glass. "God, I hate you. Don't stop." And back in the quiet house by the sea, Liam sat alone in the darkness of the kitchen. The iPad was dark now, but the words were burned into his mind. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He just sat there, listening to the slow, steady ticking of the clock, each second a hammer blow against the ruins of his heart. His perfect, beautiful world had not just been cracked, it had been utterly and irrevocably shattered. And all he could do was sit in the rubble and wait for the betrayer to come home. He waited in the dark. The house was a tomb, utterly silent except for the stoic, rhythmic tick of the clock in the hall, each sound a tiny shovel digging a grave for the life he had known. The iPad lay on the kitchen table in front of him, its screen dark, but the words he had read were seared onto the backs of his eyelids, a glowing, venomous afterimage. He wasn't angry, not anymore. The fury had burned through him hours ago, leaving behind a cold, hollow, preternatural calm. He was a man standing on a shoreline, watching impassively as a tsunami of his own, making rose from the horizon, about to obliterate everything he had ever built. He heard her car in the driveway, the soft crunch of tires on gravel. He heard her keys in the lock, the quiet click of the door opening and closing. She moved through the entryway, trying to be silent, a thief in her own home. He heard her sigh of relief, the sound of a woman who believes she has gotten away with it. She stepped into the kitchen, a silhouette against the dim light from the hall, and began to unbutton her coat. God, that gala was dreadfully boring, she whispered into the darkness, the lie falling effortlessly from her lips. I couldn't wait to get home. Home, Liam repeated, his voice emerging from the shadows, flat and devoid of all emotion. It was not a question, it was an echo, a dead word. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She fumbled for the light switch, flooding the kitchen in a harsh, unforgiving glare. She saw him then, sitting at the table, his face a pale, unreadable mask, his eyes like two black holes, and she saw the iPad on the table between them. Her breath hitched. The color, the life, the triumphant flush from her evening with Julian drained from her face, leaving behind the waxy, terrified pallor of the guilty. Liam, she began, her voice a fragile thread. I can explain. Can you? He asked, his tone dangerously quiet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He tapped the screen of the iPad, waking it, the glowing thread of her betrayal illuminating the space between them. Explain this. The champagne is cold and the bed is warm. Was it, Elena? Was the champagne cold? He looked at her, and his gaze was not that of a wronged lover, but of a scientist examining a specimen, a creature he no longer recognized. Was the bed warm? Tell me. I need to know the details of the life you chose over this one. It's not what you think, she stammered, the words hollow and meaningless. It just happened. I was going to end it. End it, he repeated. A sound that was almost a laugh, but with no humor in it, escaped his lips. It looks to me like you were just beginning. He stood up, slowly, his movements deliberate, like an old man. He walked over to the refrigerator, covered in Maya's crayon drawings, a smiling sun, a lopsided house, a picture of the three of them holding hands. He touched one of the drawings with a trembling finger. Did you think of her at all? Did either of you? This broke through her shock, replaced by a defensive anger. Don't you dare, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. You have no idea what it was like. You have no idea what he's like. Oh, but I'm beginning to, Liam said, turning to face her. I know he's the man you run to in a new dress. He's the man you wear a different perfume for. He's the man who can make you lie to me, to the man who took you in, who raised your daughter as his own flesh and blood. Each word was a precise, surgical cut. He finally allowed a flicker of the agony he felt to show in his eyes. What I don't understand, Elena, is why. This life, was it so terrible? Was my love so suffocating? Her defensive anger crumbled, and she began to weep, the deep, wrenching sobs of a soul confessing its sins. No, she cried. Your love was perfect. You were perfect. That was the problem. She looked at him, her beautiful face streaked with tears and mascara, and for the first time, she told him the whole, unvarnished truth. You're the harbor, Liam. You were my safe, beautiful harbor in the worst storm of my life. You gave me peace. You gave me a world where Maya could be safe and happy. You saved me. Then why? He begged, the cold calm finally cracking, revealing the raw, wounded man beneath. Why would you sail back out into the storm? Because some people are not meant for the harbor, she cried out, her voice filled with a self-loathing that was absolute. Some people are the storm. With you, I was safe. I was good. I was loved, but I was never whole. There is a part of me that is reckless and selfish and wild, and I hate it, but it's mine. Julian. He doesn't just see that part of me, Liam. He is that part of me. With you, I was breathing calm air. With him, I feel alive, even if it's killing me. He stared at her, the devastating, twisted logic of her confession washing over him. He had never stood a chance. His quiet, steady love was a candle against a hurricane. He had offered her a life, and she was telling him she preferred a beautiful, brilliant death. The fight went out of him, replaced by a vast, empty exhaustion. So what now? He asked, the question hanging in the ruins of their kitchen. What do we do? Elena wiped her eyes, and when she looked at him again, the anguish was gone, replaced by a cold, heartbreaking resolve. This was the final blow, the one from which there would be no recovery. There is no we anymore, she said, her voice chillingly steady. I'm leaving. I'm going back to him. Liam felt his knees buckle, and he gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. The loss of her was a wound he knew would never heal. But then came the true twist of the knife. And I'm taking Maya with me. The world went white. The very concept was impossible, a violation of the laws of nature as he understood them. No, he whispered. Number, you can't take Maya. His voice rose, filled with a panic and a pain so profound it was inhuman. She's my daughter. I'm her father. I was there when she was born. I held her. I'm the one who reads to her at night, who taught her how to ride a bike. You cannot take my daughter. Elena looked at him, and her expression was one of genuine, pitying sorrow, the kind one shows to a fool who has finally understood the rules of a game he has already lost. She was never your daughter, Liam, she said, her voice soft, but every word a shard of glass in his heart. She's his. She has always been his. She took a deep breath, delivering the final, soul-destroying verdict. We were just borrowing you. We were just borrowing this life. And now, we're going home. She turned then and walked out of the kitchen, her footsteps echoing on the stairs as she went up to pack, to wake their daughter, to erase them both from his life. Liam didn't follow. He couldn't move. He slid down to the floor, his back against the cabinets, and sat there amidst the crayon drawings and the happy memories that were now instruments of torture. The clock in the hall kept ticking. A life had been born in this house, a family had been forged, and a heart had been shattered, all in the space of 6 years. He had been the harbor, and the storm had finally come to reclaim its own. A year passed. The house grew quieter with each changing season, the silence becoming a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all memory of laughter. Winter came and buried the world in a clean white shroud, a temporary erasure of the past, but spring followed, and the thaw brought everything back. Liam continued to live in the house, a curator in the museum of his own shattered life. He taught his classes, his voice a disembodied drone talking of literary tragedies that now felt trivial compared to his own. He graded papers, he ate his meals, he slept. He existed in the spaces between the memories. He had tried, at first, to erase them. He packed away all of Maya's toys, the small shoes she had outgrown, the crayon drawings from the refrigerator. He dismantled her small bed, leaving her room a sterile, empty box. He took down Elena's paintings, the vibrant landscapes of the coast that now seemed to mock him with their brilliant, false light, but her ghost, and Maya's, refused to be exorcised. He would find a single, colorful bead from a child's bracelet under a sofa cushion, and the grief would cripple him for hours. He would open a book, and a faint trace of Elena's floral perfume would rise from the pages, and he would be back in the eye of the storm. He was tormented by questions that circled in his mind like vultures. Was any of it real? Had the 5 years of idyllic happiness been nothing more than an elaborate, long-conceived lie? He would replay their happiest moments, Maya's first steps, Elena's sleepy smile in the morning light, their nights of passionate, trusting love, and search them for the flaw, for the first sign of the crack in the foundation. But he could find none. The most painful, agonizing part was that he believed her love, in its own way, had been real. He hadn't been just a convenience, a simple means to an end. He had been a choice she had made, and then a choice she had unmade. He was the harbor, and she had genuinely, for a time, wanted to be safe. But the sea has a pull that the shore can never truly understand. Months ago, a postcard had arrived. There was no return address, no message. It was just a photograph of Maya, smiling on a sun-drenched, tropical-looking beach, a small white shell held up triumphantly in her hand. He knew it was from Elena, an act of either profound cruelty or misguided kindness. He could never be sure which. It was a confirmation that Maya was alive, that she was happy. And it was a daily, torturous reminder that her happiness was continuing, thriving, in a world that no longer included him. He knew he had to leave the house, to break the cycle. One Saturday in late summer, he drove an hour up the coast to a larger, bustling tourist town where no one knew his story. He walked along the waterfront, the noise of the crowds a welcome distraction from the silence in his own head. He bought a coffee and sat on a park bench overlooking a grand old-fashioned carousel, its cheerful tinny music, a stark contrast to the hollow ache in his chest. And then he heard it, a sound that stopped his heart. It was a peal of laughter, high-pitched and full of unadulterated joy. A laugh he knew as well as his own name. He looked up, and there they were, across the green expanse of the park, standing by the carousel. Julian, looking confident and handsome in a way that seemed to radiate wealth, lifted Maya high onto his shoulders so she could reach for the painted horses. And beside them, holding a cloud of pink cotton candy, was Elena. She was breathtaking. She wore a simple white summer dress and sunglasses, her hair longer than he remembered, and she laughed as Julian swung Maya around. From this distance, they were the perfect family, a postcard from another life, the life she had chosen. As he watched, frozen on his bench, they began to walk away, down a path that led towards the sea. Julian had Maya by the hand, pointing out at a sailboat on the water. Elena walked beside them, her hand resting in the small of Julian's back. For a moment, she turned her head, glancing back towards the park, and Liam's breath caught. He wasn't sure if she saw him. But in that split second, across the distance, as the sun caught her face, he thought he saw it again. The fleeting, almost imperceptible shadow behind her perfect smile. The same haunting sadness he had seen at Maya's birthday party. Or maybe, he thought with a fresh wave of despair, it was nothing at all. Maybe it was just his own desperate hope, a pathetic need to believe she wasn't truly happy, that a piece of her still mourned the quiet harbor she had abandoned. They disappeared into the crowd, a beautiful, happy family swallowed by the world. Liam remained on the bench, the coffee in his hand long since gone cold. The cheerful music of the carousel played on, but he no longer heard it. He looked past it, out at the vast, endless, churning gray of the Atlantic Ocean. He finally understood. You can build the strongest breakwaters. You can light the brightest beacons. You can offer a ship a safe and peaceful harbor to wait out the bad weather. You can give it a place to repair, a place to call home, but you can never, ever change the nature of the ship itself. You can never truly hold a vessel that was built, from its very first timber, for the storm.